to try to get around the Orwellian temptation. In other words, given the concentration of the media and the sort of depressing things we heard about in our earlier sessions, what have they done to struggle against that, to get their word out to the public? The second question I will ask them is, given that you have done all of that, and given that we have an election year hard upon us, what would you each individually recommend to our colleagues in the audience as to what they can do to get around the Orwellian temptation or the Orwellian threat? So those are the two questions that we'll have. And then we'll take some questions from the audience, and we'll also take a couple of questions from those Second Life people that we saw on the screen earlier. So they will revisit us again. So let me ask Alessandra to take a couple of minutes to talk a bit about her experience in dealing in the print media all over the world in trying to get the message out in a way that's truthful and represents reality as much as possible.
Well, thank you. Well, you would think, actually, that I'd be prepared to talk about this and had a lot of experience dealing with propaganda because I covered the Kremlin and the Vatican and the Reagan White House. So between the three, there'd be a lot. But I feel a little uncomfortable talking about how I have overcome this because, you know, I'm now a media critic, and people who throw stones shouldn't live in a glass house. But I will give an example from when I was in Russia, which I was there right after Gorbachev, before Putin. Believe it or not, the Yeltsin years now look like Jeffersonian, but it was a time actually of confusion, but also candor, because Russians hadn't quite figured out how the media works, how to manipulate it. They'd sort of lost the Soviet ideology and hadn't quite figured out the Putin more cynical ideology. So it was an easy time to be a journalist, and people would tell you things that they probably shouldn't have. And I'll give you a very silly example, but there was a very young, pretty girl, Katya, 22, who would arrive once a month from the Caspian carrying huge bags of caviar that she had seemingly smuggled, and she would go to Duma, and she would go to the Kremlin, and then she would eventually get around to the foreign diplomats, and then eventually to the foreign journalists. And a friend of mine finally said, you know, Katya, you're wonderful, but aren't you afraid of the mafia? She just looked at him and she said, Richard, I am the mafia. So Russia was a little bit like that. And I'll give you one other example of, only because I think it relates to what you've all been hearing today, which was that Zyuganov was the Communist Party leader who ran against Yeltsin when I was there. And he was trying to adapt Western standards of media to what was still, and is still, a hardline communist party. And he had campaign ads, which showed himself in front of an onion-domed church talking to children, and it was all very Reagan-esque, actually. Only it turned out that the people who were asking him questions were neither journalists nor voters, but people who worked for him, Communist Party members. And at the time, I thought this was quite shocking, only to return now to before FEMA even. I think it was in 2005, there was an incident in which the White House had manufactured Zyuganov-like ads. So what do? You write about it. That's what we do. And this young man writes about it even more often, so I'll turn.
Am I up? All right. You're up. But, you know, when I was thinking about how to answer this question, what I do is sorry about that. In traditional, you know, it's opinion journalism, so there's an element of advocacy to what I do, and an element of journalism, and I like to think I do it in a way where there's not a strong contradiction between the two. But there's definitely trying to make a point. There's no pretense of being a disinterested observer to a lot of debates. And there have been various times over the course of, I guess, 6 years that I've been running the site that I do, that I've moved further into the direction of what's basically activism or advocacy on a particular question. And when I do that, I think a great deal about the language that I use, the sort of strategically, what points, kind of what are the points of vulnerability in the arguments of the people that I'm arguing against. I think, like every good novelist does, thinks about the power of narrative for how people intuitively understand the world that they live in, regardless of whether they obviously are constructed in various ways. But I think about all these things. And when I do, I would try to give a lot of thought to, how different is what I am doing from a lot of the subterfuge and organized lying and propaganda that I'm trying to deconstruct. Because I'm not simply thinking of the most accurate way I can describe what I'm describing. I'm also thinking about, again, the most resonant ways that I can describe what I'm describing, and the ways that will have some meaning in the life experience of people who I'm describing it for. When I don't know how many of you were here in the last panel, but there was a lot of discussion about frames, context, the ways that our brains are not actually living in the age of enlightenment. I guess you could say that it's not only logical arguments that we respond to, it's subconscious connections between different concepts, between different words, and so forth. And this is not meant with. This is neither to say that the science underlying that thinking is flawed, because I don't think it is, or to pick a fight with the purveyors of it, but I just blanch and I'm terrified whenever these points are made in a political context, because at least from a journalist's perspective, I think that just adds to the confusion of political dialogue, adds to the use of language as a tool of obfuscation, not only for listeners but for speakers. And in my work, what I try to do, although whether I do it successfully, I don't know, is to focus on clarity and simplicity of language, and the greatest fidelity that I can find to what I actually think and how I actually understand the world that I'm living in, and try to involve myself as little as possible in any sort of second-order thinking about frames, arguments that exist that I'm working within or not working within. So that's what I try to do.
Thank you, Josh. Charlene.
I'm not sure which hat I'm wearing here, because I've worked in all of the media, print, broadcast, books, writing, and then I was a subject of news at the beginning of my career. So it gave me a unique perspective, I think, on this profession. I don't know, the others may disagree with me a little bit, but I'm not sure how much of a difference there is between all of those media, especially if you're a journalist and you have certain principles that you work by. I'm not a big believer in the term objectivity, and that'll probably make some journalists throw up. But I think that we're all creatures of our backgrounds and experiences, and so we have a set of principles that we try to adhere to as journalists, but we are affected by who we are. I came, as I said, into the profession having always, since I was about 8 or 9 years old, wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to be Brenda Starr. She could today eat her heart out. I've had such a magnificent set of experiences beyond anything I ever read in the comics that Brenda herself did. But when I became a subject of news, I think I got through that whole experience of desegregating the University of Georgia under some pretty extreme circumstances because I was watching the news people watch me. And as a result, I mean, I was relatively discerning at the age of 19.